Okay, so now I will go on to this talk, which is the first geophysical studies and descriptions of mineral deposits in Thailand. The French Jesuits under Guy Tachard and Simon de la Loubert at the Siamese court in 1687 and 1689. And that's a long time ago. Oh, doesn't it go forward? Oh, it's just there. It's just a PDF. Oh, I see.
Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine. So in 1685 and again in 1689, the Jesuit savant Pierre-Guy Tachard, who was from 1651 to 1712, he led two expeditions of astronomers and mathematicians to the court of the Kingdom of Siam, which is present-day Thailand, on behalf of the French King Louis XIV, the great so-called Sun King of France. And he was in the embassy of the Chevalier de Chaumont, the first French ambassador to Siam. So at that time, in the late 17th century, France had just established the first diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of Siam. And prior to that, a number of visitors had gone to Thailand and had, they were mainly priests of various types who visited Thailand and had spoken to the king. And he was quite interested in the scientific achievements of France. And he himself was quite interested in astronomy. So the king sent an envoy from Thailand to France, begging them to send astronomers and mathematicians to Thailand, to Siam. And so this king ruled from a place called Ayutthaya, which is just north of Bangkok, in present-day Bangkok, from 1656 to 1688. So there was an exchange of embassies between France and Thailand at that time. So the Chevalier de Chaumont, who was the one who was the first French ambassador to Siam, you can see him here on the left, presenting a letter from Louis XIV to the king, Narai of Siam. And in return, you can see Siamese ambassadors at the court of King Louis XIV in 1686. And so this was the establishment of the first diplomatic relations between these two countries. But it came about because of the king of Siam's interest in astronomy. And so he asked specifically for astronomers and mathematicians. And they were led by this man, Guy Tachard, who was a Jesuit priest. But the Jesuits at that time, it's a Catholic sect in France, which was Catholic at the time. And the Jesuits are the most learned of all the different Catholic sects. And they were the ones who studied science, including astronomy, mathematics, and other fields of science. And Tachard himself was a mathematician, and he was the leader of this group of savants who were sent by embassy. Now, before they embarked on their missions to Siam, these French Jesuits were actually, the selection process was done through the French Academy of Sciences, which had been established just a few years earlier. And they advertised for mathematicians and astronomers to go to Siam, which is a very exotic country far away in the Far East. And 150 applicants were there. And out of that, they chose 6, including Pierre Tachard, who was the leader of this expedition. And he wrote a book based on his first voyage, which was this is the title page. It was published in 1686. So this group of 6 astronomers and mathematicians, they came down on their way to Siam. They stopped at the Cape of Good Hope in 1685. They arrived on the 31st of May and stayed for just a week, and they left on the 6th of June. But during that time, and remember, these were people from the French court, and at that time, the Cape of Good Hope was under the Dutch East India Company rule, and they had a governor there, Simon van der Stel, after whom Stellenbosch is named. And they were very well received, the Jesuits at the Cape. They were, in fact, the first real scientific expedition to South Africa. And during their short time at the Cape, during that first visit, they wanted to do astronomical observations at the Cape, which had never been done before. So they got permission from the governor he installed them in a beautiful villa, which was in the Company Gardens in Cape Town. And that site where this villa was, there's a fanciful representation. It's not really realistic. It wasn't on the shoreline. It was a bit inland where the Company Gardens are. And it was a site that is now occupied by Tuinhuis, which is the site where the president's residency is now in Cape Town, so just behind the Parliament buildings. And this is where they established a temporary observatory, and they came with tons of equipment. They had telescopes of all kinds. They had all kinds of geophysical equipment. They had magnetometers, mirrors, things for measuring barometric pressure, and all kinds of instruments. There are literally tons of equipment. And they established themselves in this observatory, and they actually they tried to determine for their benefit and also for the benefit of the Dutch at the Cape, the actual longitude of Cape Town, which is a big problem in those days, the determination of exact longitude. And they used Cassini's tables of ephemerides for the transits of the Galilean satellites of Jupiter. Because in order to tell time, you either have to have a solar or a lunar eclipse, which wasn't present during the short time they were there. So they used the transits of the moons of Jupiter, and they established, a timing according to the tables established by the famous astronomer Cassini. But they only spent 6 days there, after which they then departed for Siam. But they first stopped in Batavia, in present-day Jakarta, Indonesia, which is also a Dutch colony, and so was Malacca on the Malay coast, before they reached the Gulf of Siam on the 22nd of September, 1685. Now, then they managed to get to the court of the king, and he was very pleased with his astronomers. He was very impressed with their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and he was, in fact, so impressed that he asked Guy Tachard to go back to France and beg the King of France to send him another 10 astronomers and mathematicians. 5 wasn't enough. So actually, Tachard did that, and he returned to France with a Siamese envoy and managed to get an audience again with King Louis XIV, and persuaded them to the king to accede to the demands of the Siamese king, and actually got 10 more astronomers. In fact, they got 11 more astronomers in the end to come back with him back to Siam. Now, during that time, when he was absent, coming back to France to bring more astronomers, he had left behind 5 astronomers and mathematicians in Thailand. So I'm going to tell you what they did while Tachard was absent. And when Tachard came back with this whole group of, the second group of astronomers, he wrote a book again a few years later in 1689 about his second voyage. Right? These are all copies of books that are in my library. I've got first editions of these 2 books. And so Tachard's second voyage was interesting because he brought back, aside from the first voyage, they established that little observatory in Cape Town. But on his second voyage, he brought more astronomers and mathematicians, and they also collected plants from the Cape. And these are some of the first illustrations of the Cape flora that we have on record, dating back from the 1680s. And they were doing this on behalf of a certain Monsieur Thévenot. And he was the one who instructed them at the Academy of Science in Paris before they left, and said, you've got to collect plants, you've got to collect rocks from the top of Table Mountain. And they said, why? He said, well, to prove that the sea had been there. So they, this was recorded by Tachard. He said, Monsieur Thévenot, even before our first voyage, had advised us to seek enlightenment about a theory which, however strange, had been assured was true. And this was that indubitable evidence could be found on lofty Table Mountain. As you know, it's a kilometer high. that the sea had once passed over it. Now, the fathers Leblanc and de Bez resolved to examine the statement, the truth of the statement, and what they discovered will assuredly prove interesting. So these two guys, they didn't resolve to examine it. They were commandeered. You guys will climb up Table Mountain and get some rocks there and bring them back, and let's see what you find. And unfortunately, what they found, this is from a letter by one of those de Bez, and it said, I had some earth dug up for the satisfaction of Monsieur Thévenot. It is very black and full of sand and small white pebbles. Such, my dear father, is a brief account of our journey. I regret to have to end my letter in a sorry fashion. So actually, this whole thing is a story on its own, and I've just written a paper on that, and that will be coming out later this year. So the whole expedition to the Table Mountains, all right? But that was just a side thing from the actual reason why they were going, which was to Siam, all right, for their astronomical observations. So now on the second voyage, on the first voyage, this was the embassy of Chevalier de Chaumont, who himself wrote his own book about this journey. So you have Tachard, who wrote 2 accounts, Chevalier de Chaumont wrote 2 accounts, and almost every one of the people who were on the expeditions, they wrote their own accounts. So we have about 10 different accounts of this amazing French expedition, the 2 expeditions to Siam at that time. So it's very well recorded historically, but funny enough, the scientific results, aside from the astronomical results, have not really been talked about. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So in Chevalier de Chaumont's book, which, because he was an ambassador, he had more money, so he published beautiful diagrams in his book. And this is from his book, 1686. And this shows his map of Thailand, or Siam, as it was called then. And you can see the kind of maps they had in those days. And you can see the beautiful elephants illustrating this map. And if you look at the same map, I'll show you a close-up of the region around the southern part of Thailand. This is the Gulf of Siam. And at the head of this gulf is what was then just a very tiny city called Bangkok, which you can see just over there. On this map, it was not a big city as it is today, because the real capital was this place called Siam de Judea on this map, which is called Ayutthaya today. That was the name back then as well. And another place called Lovo, which is still a present-day city, town, where the king had his palace. So another palace out there. And so these are the places of interest in this map. And note that there is a river that's flowing southwards, the Chao Phraya River, which ends up south of Bangkok in the Gulf of Siam. So the king himself was, as I said, very interested in the astronomy, and he participated in the activities of these astronomers whom at his palace. He set them up on a terrace near his palace to observe a lunar eclipse, as shown in the slide in December of 1685. And he kept his promise to build an observatory for these astronomers. And he modeled his observatory, which is the one that's shown on the left here. And that's the ruins of that observatory as it stands today at a place called Wat San Paulo at Lopburi. It was built in 1686, but it was modeled on the one in Paris. And it's the exact same plans that were used for this observatory, which was built in 1671. So it was a very similar observatory that was built for these astronomers. And they made all kinds of observations of eclipses, solar, lunar eclipses. And here the king was observing a solar eclipse of the 30th of April, 1688, accompanied by the Jesuit astronomers at that observatory. So now Tachard records in his second voyage very interesting things about these voyages. And the most interesting account of the work done in Siam by the Jesuits is of a visit paid by 2 of them, Fathers Claude de Videlon and Joachim Bouvet. And this happened while Tachard himself was back in France, trying to bring back a second group of astronomers. So the group that he had left behind, the 5 astronomers and mathematicians, 2 of them decided to embark on a journey by boat north of Lopburi to visit some magnetite mines that they had heard about. So they were traveling to this magnetite mine situated in the China district, and the journey was made while Tasha was absent. But the account appears in Tasha's book in 1689. And Tasha said the principal motive of this trip was to engage in the solution of this important problem, whether the variation in the compass is caused by the unequal attraction of magnetic parts of the terrestrial globe. Now, I will come back to this a little bit in more detail. So he was trying to find out what is causing magnetic attraction. What's going on?
You can carry on going to
Oh.
who's going there.
Oh,
There,
okay.
no, it's back.
All right. So,
Oh, yes. It's the screen.
okay. So they wanted to know if the variations of the magnetic compass are caused by something global or is it local? And that's what they were doing. And this is the very first geophysical expedition in the world where they were trying to test this idea. So that's quite interesting. And they said, we hoped that making several observations as we approached the iron ore mines, which according to the report had been given us, is insufficiently strong to produce sensible effects for a radius of 0 to 30 leagues around, that we would find changes in the variation which would only be attributed to different positions in which the needle would find itself with respect to the attraction on its poles, thereby allowing us to draw general conclusions that all irregularities come from the same principle. Anyway, that's a very wordy way of putting it. So what they did was they embarked on these kinds of boats. This is an illustration from that time. And they went up the Chao Phraya River, but they were armed with a magnetometer, right? With a magnetic compass, rather, not a magnetometer, of course. Magnetic compass, and they were just looking at the variations in the needle of the magnetic compass. But they all knew about the fact that the Earth behaves like a magnet. But they wanted to see what variations would happen as they approached the iron mines. So they were heading up this part of the Chao Phraya River, heading towards those mines. And you can see illustrations here of elephants at the time. And part of the journey, they left the boats and they went on elephants. So here they were approaching the iron mine, the iron mines in Thailand with a compass on top of an elephant-born geophysics. Now that was like prior to all the modern drones and various other platforms that you use in geophysics, right? So, and this is an elephant that I photographed in Thailand last year. So, so they approached these mines, and this is the region around Lopburi where they were around where the iron mines are, and there's a fold belt here with limestones that have been deformed and intruded by granites, and on the margins of these granites there are skarns in which you find things like wollastonite. There's some copper mineralization that was mined in some of the mines, but also lots of iron oxides, magnetite and hematite. And that's what they were mining in these particular iron ore mines. They were mining iron-rich skarns as a source of iron ore. And so these mines had been, there were several of these mines. And here is the remains of the city of Ayutthaya, which was the capital of Siam in the 17th century. The king himself, he had his palace at Lopburi, just along the river north of Ayutthaya. And these were plans of the town of Ayutthaya produced by the French in the 18th century, about half a century later. Now, I mentioned the idea of the Earth being regarded as a magnet. That idea came from William Gilbert, who was the pioneer in the study of the Earth's magnetic field. And he published a famous book called De Magnete, which was published in 1600. This is a 1628 edition that you see here. It went through many, many different editions, and it was the primary work in the field of magnetic studies. And so it says William Gilbert regarded the Earth as having a magnet in the middle, which is the way we still imagine it today, having like a bar magnet in the interior of the Earth. But there were also variations and they wanted to test whether the variations were due to the internal magnetic field of the Earth or due to concentrations of rock types that could have been magnetic. And so they said it's unquestionable that variation by an absolute necessity will always follow irregularities which arise from the different alterations with the parts of the Earth, or if you will, magnetite mines, which it is full, receive at different times. So they were trying to test this idea of whether the magnetite mines will have an effect on the magnetic field. And here is a modern day geophysical map showing the magnetic field of this region in Thailand. Here's the Gulf of Siam down here. And this region is a region around Ayutthaya and Lopburi and the Chao Phraya River, which they visited. And these big magnetic anomalies are due to those presence of those iron-rich skarns around the intrusive granites. And so what did they find? Well, as they approached these mines, they took measurements of the magnetic declination and found huge variations in the magnetic field by the needle as they approached the magnetite mines. So they concluded that the local concentrations of magnetite were responsible for the magnetic anomalies and cautioned against the use of magnetic compasses when constructing maps of the region. Just like our students, some of you guys in the audience are cautioned about when you're mapping for your second year projects on Wits campus and you go to the banded iron formation outcrop in Yatsmats Avenue, don't use a magnetic compass because it's magnetic. And the rock outcrop itself is going to give variations in the needle. But this was the first place in the world where it was found by these Jesuits going up a river on elephant back to these magnetite mines. Now, on the second expedition that Bashar made to Thailand, he was accompanied by another diplomat called Simon de la Loubert, who wrote his own book about Siam, the historical, this is an English translation, historical relation of the kingdom of Siam. And he also wrote about the mineral resources of Siam. So we had the first geophysical study of Siam, but also, de la Loubert, and this is from his book, he shows these maps and these rivers going up northwards. And these Jesuits, they sailed up the Chao Phraya River from its mouth up to Ayutthaya and further north to Lopburi and Chainat, where the geophysicists had been, are the astronomers, if you like. He also mentions the iron ore mines at Lopburi and so on. So he wrote up in his book an account of the mineral resources of Siam, but he wasn't the first person. The first one to do that was Van Schoten, who worked for the Dutch East India Company. In 1636, he wrote a report about the mineral resources of Siam, and he wrote that the dominion and revenue of the crown is great, amounting to yearly to many millions, arising out of the inland commodities, rice, wood, and then tin, lead, and saltpeter, and also the profits of the sand and mountain gold, which are only sold by the king's factors to foreign merchants. So he was the first one to talk about all the different mineral deposits. And then Simon de la Loubert in 1691, he wrote about the mineral resources of Siam. And he said, no country has a greater reputation of being rich in mines than the country of Siam. And the great quantity of idols and other castes are seen, evinces that they have better cultivated there in former times than now. And so what he's referring to is all these temples, the many, many temples, Buddhist temples in Thailand, which are covered in gold. And you can see them still in the museums in Thailand. There's a wooden statue that's covered in gold leaf. And you've got gold jewelry that has been excavated at Ayutthaya with lots of other gemstones as well, and other examples of gold jewelry and so on. So they certainly had lots of gold mines. And then they said they do likewise daily discover pits anciently dug and the remains of many furnaces which are thought to have been abandoned during the ancient wars of Pegu. So they've had previous wars in the past, and so there were lots of changes in the history of Siam. And he says, nevertheless, the king now reigns, who now reigns, has not been able to find any vein of gold or silver, and is worth the pains that he had therein employed, although he has applied unto this work some Europeans, and among the rest a Spaniard that came from Mexico, who found, if not a great fortune, at least his subsistence for 20 years, even to his death, by flattering the avarice of this prince with imaginary promises of infinite treasures. So he's not the first guy who's led on investors and saying, well, yeah, well, it's been happening for a long, long time. Okay. So this Mexican came to Siam, and yeah. So, well, but what's interesting is that the Siamese themselves, although they'd been mining small scale, they employed foreigners to come tell them more about exploiting their mines. And then de la Lubert further stated that they have numerous profitable mines of lead and tin, which they mix with cadmia. And cadmia, is cadmium, which occurs with zinc in lead zinc deposits, right? So they mix the lead and tin with cadmia to render it harder and whiter, but more brittle, to produce a white tin, which they call tontinac. And he noted the lodestone mines, which are the iron ore mines near Louvo, the iron mines near Kampeng Pet, as well as occurrences of agates and sapphires, and the recent discovery of diamonds. And you would think, yeah, how could they find diamonds in Southeast Asia, which is like, it's a mobile belt, it's not a crater, but yet there are diamonds there because they're remnants of old Gondwana that are caught up in Thailand. Also, diamonds are well known from Borneo, right? So diamonds were found back then. And a French physician, Monsieur Vincent Francois, was given 1,000 écus by the king of Siam to inspect the work on his mines, and he shortly discovered many mines, including of iron, crystal, antimony, emeralds, white marble, and one of gold, which, so far as he could judge without assays, was very rich, but which he would not show to the natives, according to La Lubert. So these are some pieces of ore, of different metals, ores, and these are gemstones from the collections there's a museum in Ayutthaya, the old capital of Siam, and so it's evidence of clearly of a well-established mining industry in Thailand at that time in the 17th century. But the accounts that we have from the French are the very first accounts of the mineral resources of Siam, and also the work that was done by the Jesuits, the first account of the geophysics. And one of the commodities that was mentioned there was saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. And what is it used for? Gunpowder.
Sodium.
KNO2.
Supposed to be sodium.
Well, I don't know. I think they also call this potassium nitrate, saltpeter as well. I think it was a word. So they say they do make very bad gunpowder. The defect, they say, proceeds from the saltpeter, which they gather from the rocks and is made from the dung of bats, animals which are exceedingly large and very plentiful throughout the Indies. But whether this saltpeter be good or bad, the king of Siam sells a great deal of it to strangers. That was de la Lubert. And other people like Van Schoten also mentioned saltpeter production from North Bengal in Bihar back in the 1660s. And in fact, that's a practice that is still going on today in modern day India. They still make saltpeter by the traditional method of taking soils impregnated with these salts and boiling it and removing this from there. So Chevalier de Chaumont also reported on the goods that were being exported from Siam at that time, and they were exporting to China, Macau, Japan, Timor, Cochin China, which is part of Vietnam, Tonkin China, also Vietnam, Laos, and to India, Surat. So lots of different commodities that you see, gold, tin, silver, rubies, copper, etc., vermilion, quicksilver, that's, mercury, and saltpeter, and so on. And then they also imported from Borneo, They imported gold, pearls, and the most beautiful diamonds in the world. So it was already that Borneo diamond deposits were being exploited even back in the 17th century. Now, what happened to all of this after these two embassies establishing all these relations between France and Siam and all these savants who came, you know, if that had continued, it would have been wonderful. But what happened was not the way that it was planned. King Narai was actually, he died in 1688 at the time when Tashar had come back after his second expedition, came back with more Siamese diplomats, going back to the King of France to report on the second expedition. He even went as far as to visit the Pope in Rome. All right, and here's the report here. This document is an account in 1689 in Latin about the visit to the Pope by Tashar and the Siamese ambassador. But what had happened in the meantime is that there had been a coup in Thailand. The king was deposed by his younger brother, and who was very wary of the motives of the French. So they weren't just coming here to bring out some science and some astronomy and mathematics. They want to convert all of us to Christianity. And so he banished all the French, and they were sent out post haste. They were basically, you know, all deported out of the kingdom of Siam, and then they ended up in India, and then eventually back to France. And they were kicked out, never to come back until a couple of 100 years later. The French only returned in the 19th century with that king who was featured in that movie, The King and I, you know, who wanted to get a Western education. So that was the end of the relationships between France and Siam from the time of King Louis XIV. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I